The sun had barely risen over the rolling fields of Maple Creek County. Golden rays stretched across acres of wheat that swayed gently in the morning breeze, just as they had for generations. For most people driving along the highway, this old farm looked ordinary. A weathered barn, a rusty tractor, a worn wooden fence. Nothing more than another forgotten piece of countryside waiting to disappear. But for 72-year-old Walter Hayes, this wasn't just land. It was his entire life. Walter had been born in the small white farmhouse standing at the center of those fields. His father had built the barn with his own hands after returning from the Second World War. His grandfather had planted the first oak tree near the entrance nearly 90 years earlier. Every inch of soil carried memories that no amount of money could ever replace. As a young boy, Walter spent every summer chasing chickens across the yard, helping his father repair fences and learning how to grow crops from the earth. His father always told him, "A man doesn't own the land, he's only borrowing it from the next generation." Walter never forgot those words. Years passed. He got married, raised 2 children, worked through droughts, floods, harsh winters, and seasons when there wasn't enough money to buy new equipment. Still, he never sold a single acre, even when nearby farmers accepted offers from developers, even when shopping centers replaced old cornfields, even when luxury neighborhoods swallowed entire ranches. Walter stayed, because to him, some things were worth more than money. But times had changed. The city was growing faster than anyone expected. New highways, new apartment buildings, new shopping districts. Every month another piece of farmland disappeared beneath concrete. Developers called it progress. The local government called it economic growth. Investors called it opportunity. Walter simply called it the end of home. 3 years earlier, a massive development company called Redstone Urban Development arrived in Maple Creek. Their plan was ambitious. Build over 2,000 luxury homes, a golf course, shopping centers, private schools, and an artificial lake. There was only one problem. Walter's farm sat directly in the center of the entire project. Without his land, nothing connected. Roads couldn't meet. Pipelines couldn't be installed. The entire master plan had one missing piece. Walter Hayes. At first, the company offered him $2 million. People in town thought he was crazy for refusing. "You'll never see an offer like that again. You could retire tomorrow. You've already lived here long enough." But Walter always smiled politely and answered with the same sentence. "Some things aren't for sale." Months later, the offer became $4 million, then $6 million, then nearly $8 million. Every offer came with lawyers, surveyors, real estate agents, city officials. Everyone promised him a better future. Everyone insisted this old farm had no future left. Walter listened carefully every single time, then quietly closed the front gate behind them, as if the conversation had never happened. That only made the developers more desperate. Soon, letters started arriving. Tax reassessments, environmental inspections, noise complaints, safety violations. Somehow, problems that had never existed before suddenly appeared every month. Walter knew exactly what they were trying to do. Pressure him, wear him down, make him give up. But he had survived droughts that killed entire harvests. He had survived losing his wife to cancer 10 years earlier. He had survived every hardship life had thrown at him. Paperwork didn't scare him. One cold November afternoon, a black SUV rolled slowly into his driveway. This visit felt different. A sharply dressed man stepped out carrying a leather briefcase. His shoes never touched the mud. His expensive watch sparkled in the afternoon sunlight. He introduced himself. "My name is Richard Collins, Senior Director at Redstone Urban Development." Walter simply nodded. Richard smiled. "I think it's time we stop wasting each other's time." He opened the briefcase. Inside, a single contract. And one number. $10 million. Richard leaned forward. "You'll never receive a higher offer." Walter stared quietly at the paper. $10 million. Enough money for several lifetimes. Enough to buy any house he wanted. Enough to travel the world. Enough to retire without ever worrying again. Richard smiled confidently. No farmer says no to 10 million. Walter slowly folded the contract, placed it back inside the briefcase, closed the lid, then looked Richard directly in the eyes. His voice remained calm, soft, almost gentle. "You've misunderstood something." Richard frowned. Walter continued. "You think you're buying land." He shook his head. "But you're trying to buy my family." Silence filled the porch. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Richard finally stood. His smile had completely disappeared. As he walked back toward the SUV, he stopped beside the old oak tree near the entrance. Without turning around, he quietly said, "If you won't sell willingly, the city has other ways." Walter watched the black SUV disappear down the dusty road. Deep inside, for the very first time, he felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Not fear, not anger, but uncertainty. Because somehow, Richard sounded absolutely certain. And exactly 1 week later, 3 bright yellow bulldozers arrived outside Walter's front gate the next morning. The sound arrived before the machines did. A deep mechanical rumble echoed across the quiet valley. Walter looked out his kitchen window. 3 massive yellow bulldozers. 2 excavators. Several city trucks. And nearly 20 construction workers had lined up outside his property. Dust filled the air as their engines idled. Walter slowly placed his coffee mug on the wooden table. He already knew why they were here. He just never imagined it would happen this fast. As he stepped onto the front porch, another black SUV pulled into the driveway. Richard Collins climbed out once again. This time, he wasn't smiling. He walked toward Walter holding a thick folder. "Mr. Hayes, the City Council approved the emergency acquisition order yesterday evening." Walter frowned. "What acquisition order?" Richard handed him several documents. "The state has declared this project to be in the public interest. The land is now scheduled for compulsory purchase." Walter scanned the papers. Page after page of legal language. Government seals. Official signatures. Deadlines. Appeal notices. Everything looked perfectly legal. Richard spoke calmly. "You still have the right to challenge this. But construction begins today." Walter looked beyond Richard. Workers were already unloading fencing equipment. Surveyors had begun placing orange flags throughout the fields. His wheat, the crop he had spent months growing, was now covered with fluorescent markers. One worker hammered a metal stake directly beside the old oak tree planted by Walter's grandfather. Walter walked over, pulled the stake from the ground, and quietly placed it back in the worker's hands. "This tree stays." The worker looked toward Richard. Richard sighed. "Continue." Within minutes, the roar of engines filled the air. Steel tracks crushed the dirt roads Walter had driven on for decades. The first wooden fence collapsed beneath a bulldozer blade. Boards snapped like matchsticks. Walter didn't move. He simply watched. The same fence his father had repaired every spring. was gone in seconds. A neighbor named Samuel drove over in his pickup truck. He jumped out. "Walter, you can't let them do this." Walter smiled weakly. "I don't think they're asking anymore." Soon, more neighbors gathered. Some recorded videos. Others argued with city officials. A few simply stood in silence. Everyone knew Walter. Everyone respected him. But no one knew how to stop what was happening. Television reporters soon arrived. Microphones. Camera crews. News helicopters circled overhead. One reporter approached Walter. "Mr. Hayes, how does it feel watching your family's farm disappear?" Walter looked across the fields. His voice remained steady. "It doesn't disappear today. It disappears every time people forget what land really means." The reporter lowered her microphone. There was nothing more to ask. Meanwhile, bulldozers continued moving forward. One after another. Old sheds collapsed. Storage buildings were reduced to splinters. Decades of history vanished beneath steel blades. Then, one operator approached the oldest section of the property. A small grassy hill behind the original farmhouse. Hardly anyone ever went there anymore. Even Walter rarely visited. It was simply an empty patch of land. Or so everyone believed. The bulldozer accelerated. Its massive blade lowered. The operator pushed forward. Suddenly, clang, a loud metallic impact echoed across the farm. The entire bulldozer shook violently. The machine stopped instantly. The operator looked confused. He tried again. The blade refused to move. Instead, the bulldozer's tracks began spinning helplessly. Construction workers gathered around. What was that? Bedrock. Old farming equipment. No one knew. Richard frowned. Dig around it. Workers grabbed shovels. Minutes turned into nearly an hour. The deeper they dug, the stranger things became. There was no rock. No buried tractor. Instead, they uncovered perfectly flat steel. Covered in rust. Far too smooth to be natural. One worker brushed away another layer of dirt. His eyes widened. "This isn't a pipe." Another worker knelt beside him. "No, it's a door." Silence spread across the construction site. Everyone stared. Moory dirt was cleared away. Slowly, an enormous circular iron hatch emerged from beneath the soil. Nearly 20 feet across. Covered with thick rust. Massive locking bolts surrounded its edges. Someone whistled. "What kind of farm has something like this?" Richard stepped closer. His confidence had vanished. He immediately ordered every machine to stop. Within minutes, city engineers arrived. Then police officers. The entire construction site was suddenly treated like a restricted area. Yellow tape surrounded the mysterious structure. Walter slowly walked toward the hatch. His face showed genuine confusion. "I've lived here my whole life. I never knew this was here." An elderly neighbor stepped forward. "I remember my grandfather talking about soldiers coming through here during the war. But everyone thought it was just an old story." The engineer knelt beside the hatch. He wiped away decades of dirt from a faded metal plate. Almost impossible to read. But one word remained visible. Property of the United States government. Everyone froze. Richard's phone began ringing. Again, and again, and again. Within the next 30 minutes, black government vehicles entered the farm. Men in dark suits stepped out. No company logos. No introductions. No explanations. One of them looked directly at Richard. "You need to evacuate every civilian immediately." Richard protested. "This is our construction site." The man didn't even blink. Not anymore. Walter watched as federal officers surrounded the hatch. Whatever lay beneath his farm, it was far bigger than anyone had imagined. The entire farm fell silent. The bulldozers that had been tearing through Walter Hayes' property just moments earlier now stood motionless. Construction workers whispered among themselves. Even the television reporters kept their distance. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the massive steel hatch buried beneath the earth. Within an hour, more vehicles arrived. Not police, not construction crews, military trucks. Dark SUVs with government license plates rolled through the front gate. Men and women wearing plain jackets stepped out, carrying black equipment cases. None of them introduced themselves. One man approached Walter. "Mr. Hayes." Walter nodded. "I'm Agent Daniel Brooks. We need to ask you a few questions." Walter looked confused. "I've lived here my whole life. If you're asking about that door, I know as much as you do." Agent Brooks studied Walter's face for several seconds. He could tell the old farmer wasn't lying. "Has anyone ever dug in this area before?" Walter thought carefully. "My father always told me not to." Brooks looked up. "Not to." Walter pointed toward the grassy hill. He said his father warned him to leave this part of the farm alone. "I always assumed it was because the soil was too rocky." The agents exchanged uneasy glances. One engineer knelt beside the steel hatch. He carefully cleaned away decades of dirt until faded numbers became visible. He read them aloud. "Vault B17. Silence. Another engineer looked at him. "You've heard of it." The man slowly nodded. "But I thought every B-series bunker had been destroyed decades ago." Walter frowned. "What is a B-series bunker?" No one answered. Instead, the agents began unloading advanced scanning equipment. Large machines rolled across the ground. Screens displayed underground images. Within minutes, the expressions on every engineer's face changed. One woman quietly whispered, "This can't be right." Agent Brooks walked over. "What did you find?" She pointed toward the monitor. "The bunker doesn't end here." She zoomed out. There are multiple underground chambers, and extending almost half a mile beneath this property. Walter couldn't believe what he was hearing. Half a mile. Under his farm. Brooks immediately grabbed his radio. "Seal every entrance. No one enters until structural integrity is confirmed." Meanwhile, news helicopters circled overhead. Social media exploded. Videos of the mysterious hatch spread across the internet. Millions of people watched construction workers standing around the enormous underground door. Television networks interrupted regular programming. Breaking news. Possible secret government facility discovered beneath rural farmland. Within hours, people from neighboring towns gathered outside Walter's property. Hundreds stood behind police barricades. Speculation spread rapidly. Some believed it was an abandoned military base. Others claimed it was a hidden treasure vault. Conspiracy theories flooded the internet. Walter ignored them all. His attention remained fixed on the hatch. He couldn't stop thinking about his father. Why had he never spoken about this? Late that afternoon, the engineering team finally finished inspecting the structure. One technician approached Agent Brooks. "The locking system is completely mechanical. No electronic security. No signs anyone has entered for decades." Brooks nodded. "Can we open it?" The technician hesitated. "We can, but once it's opened, we have no idea what's waiting inside." Brooks looked around. Every camera lens in America seemed pointed toward that single steel door. He made a decision. Open it. Workers attached heavy industrial chains to the rusted locking wheel. A powerful hydraulic crane began pulling. Nothing happened. Again, the crane strained. Steel cables tightened. The old hatch groaned loudly. Dust poured from its edges. Still, it refused to move. The chief engineer stepped forward. It's sealed from pressure. We'll need to release the locking bolts manually. One by one, workers removed enormous rusted bolts that hadn't moved in perhaps 70 years. Each bolt weighed nearly 50 pounds. As the final bolt fell onto the dirt, everyone stepped back. The crane pulled once more. A deep metallic sound echoed across the valley. For the first time in generations, the massive hatch slowly lifted. A cold gust of air escaped from below. Air that smelled old, dry, almost untouched by time. Darkness filled the opening. No lights, no movement. Just an endless black tunnel descending beneath Walter's farm. One engineer lowered a powerful flashlight. The beam disappeared into the darkness. It goes deeper than we thought. Brooks turned toward his team. Recon unit first. 4 agents wearing helmets and protective gear carefully climbed down the steel ladder attached to the wall. The cameras above could only watch. Minutes passed. No one spoke. Then, a voice crackled over the radio. Control. You need to see this. Brooks grabbed the receiver. What did you find? There was a long pause. The agent sounded almost breathless. This isn't just a bunker. It's an entire underground facility. Another pause. And there are vehicles down here. Brooks frowned. Military vehicles. No, sir. They've never been registered. The signal briefly cut out. Static filled the radio. Then one final sentence came through. There's something else. You're not going to believe it. The transmission suddenly ended. Agent Brooks looked toward the darkness below. For the first time that day. Even he seemed nervous. Whatever had been hidden beneath Walter Hayes' farm. It was far bigger than anyone had imagined. The silence inside the bunker was almost unbearable. Only the sound of boots echoing through the endless concrete hallway could be heard. Agent Brooks led the team carefully forward, their flashlights cutting through decades of darkness. Dust floated through the cold air. Nothing had disturbed this place for generations. Rows of steel shelves stretched into the distance. Old communication equipment stood exactly where it had been left. Maps covered the walls. Faded American flags still hung from rusted poles. It looked as if everyone had simply walked away. And never returned. One engineer stopped beside an old metal cabinet. Inside were dozens of sealed folders marked classified. The dates shocked everyone. 1959, 1961, 1963. Everything inside the bunker had been preserved like a time capsule. Another agent called out. Sir, you need to see this. The team entered a massive underground chamber. Parked inside were military transport vehicles covered in thick layers of dust. Their tires had never moved. Their fuel tanks were still sealed. It was as though time itself had frozen underground. Then they noticed something even stranger. At the center of the room stood an enormous steel safe. Nearly 12 feet tall. Stamped into the front were the words, United States Army Engineering Division. No one spoke. The safe door had already been unlocked. Slowly, Agent Brooks pulled it open. Inside, there wasn't gold. There weren't weapons. There weren't stacks of cash. Instead, hundreds of leather-bound documents, property records, historical surveys, original land ownership maps, and one small wooden box. Brooks carefully opened it. Inside rested a handwritten letter. Its paper had turned yellow with age. Across the top, one name immediately caught his attention. Walter Hayes, S.R. Brooks looked at Walter. "Your father." Walter nodded slowly. His hands trembled as Brooks passed him the letter. Walter unfolded it with great care. The handwriting belonged to his father. "If you're reading this, then someone has finally found what we promised to protect." Walter's eyes filled with tears. The letter explained that during the Cold War, the government secretly built an emergency command facility beneath the Hayes family farm. Walter's grandfather had agreed to protect its location. Not for money, not for power, but because he believed it would protect thousands of lives if the country was ever attacked. Only 3 members of the Hayes family had ever known the truth. His grandfather, his father, and now, Walter. His father never told him because the government had officially abandoned the facility decades earlier. He believed the secret should disappear with him. Walter slowly lowered the letter. Everything suddenly made sense. The old warnings, the untouched hill, the mysterious stories his grandfather used to tell. None of them had been myths. They had been protecting history. Back above ground, government historians began examining the documents. Within hours, the discovery was declared one of the most significant Cold War finds in the state. Construction on the housing project was permanently suspended. The land immediately received historic protection. No bulldozer would ever touch it again. Richard Collins watched from behind the police barrier. Months of planning. Millions of dollars. Everything was gone. He quietly walked over to Walter. For the first time, there was no arrogance in his voice. "I'm sorry." Walter looked at the fields glowing beneath the evening sun. "My father used to tell me, the land always remembers who protects it, and who tries to destroy it." Richard lowered his head. Without another word, he walked away. Over the following months, the old farm transformed into something entirely different. Historians restored the farmhouse. Engineers preserved the underground bunker. Students from across the country came to learn its remarkable history. The Hayes family farm became a protected historical landmark. People no longer visited because of the mystery. They visited because one ordinary farmer had refused to sell the place his family loved. Walter never became rich. He never moved into a mansion. He never bought expensive cars. Instead, every morning, he still walked across the same fields, fed the chickens, watched the sunrise, and smiled, because he had kept the promise his grandfather made nearly a century earlier. Sometimes, the greatest treasures aren't hidden in vaults. They're hidden in the courage to stand your ground, even when the whole world tells you to walk away.